And the reason why this is important is, as I was saying earlier, for the new investor, it can be a little bit of a minefield you have to navigate because there are a lot of laws and regulations in Ontario, and most of them favor the tenant, right? And tenants know this, and they're always looking for opportunities to stick it to the landlord, right? It's just the honest truth. And to be honest, I fell prey to a lot of that stuff when I was first starting out. I had some bad tenants, and I had to learn this stuff, and I had to go to court and go to war, essentially, is what it is. So all residential tenancies in Ontario are for 1 year. After the first year, they automatically go month to month. So one of the things is you cannot force the tenant to sign a new lease after the first year, right? All regulations under this law apply to all leases, residential leases in Ontario, whether it's written, whether you have a written lease or you don't have a written lease, right? Last year, April 30th of 2018, the government changed the Residential Tenancies Act. They amended it, and now they have a standardized lease. You have to go onto the government website, download it. You have to use their lease. No longer can a landlord write up their own lease, right? And you have to give the tenant a copy of the lease. And conveniently, it has all their rights and tells them how to screw you, right? The landlord can collect first and last month's rent legally. You can't collect any more deposits. So no damage deposits, no security deposits, nothing like that. Landlord must provide a copy of the lease, and if they want rent receipts for the taxes, you have to provide those, and you can't charge for any of that. So, as part of that amendment to the Act last year, they expanded their rent control. So it used to be that rent control only applied to certain buildings, apartment buildings that were built during certain years. So the small-scale landlord like myself, it didn't apply to, right? Now it applies to everybody in Ontario, right? So rent control, meaning that the government tells you how much you can raise the rent each year. And usually it's a minuscule amount, like 1.8%, something like this, right? So it used to be that if rents went up in my area, I could say to my tenant, and all you got to do is give them 60 days notice. You know, rent's going from $2,000 to $2,300. And they had a choice. They could pay it or leave, right? Now you can't do that anymore. The government tells you how much you can raise the rent. Kind of sucks. But one of the ways, probably the only way to get around this, is to get the tenant out. If you can get the tenant out, you can reset the rent at whatever rate you want. The other one is if you buy a new property that has never been rented before, after November 30th of 2018, these rent controls don't apply, right? So it's only to pre-existing rental units. That was Dub Ford law.
So purchasing a unit where there already has occupancy in it, currently being used as a rental, those restrictions will come to me as I purchase.
Yeah. And so the only way you'd be able to raise the rent above the guidelines is either apply to the landlord-tenant board, which rarely works, or get the tenant out, and then the new tenant will be paying whatever you set the rent at.
So if your lease is up, say, when I take possession, I have the option to not renew them, and have to go or to take them on.
So if you're buying, so when it comes to buying a rental property, I always recommend get vacant possession. Never inherit a tenant, right? Usually if somebody has a good rental property, they're not looking to sell it. The most common reason why people sell rental properties is a problem tenant. And so you don't know what you're getting into when you inherit a tenant. So have in your purchase and sale agreement a clause for vacant possession. So that way the landlord, the existing landlord, will give their tenant 60 days notice that they're selling and they have to leave, right? Which they can only do after the first year lease is up. So once that original tenant's first year is up, the landlord can sell the property with vacant possession. You now buy it, you get your own tenant in at whatever price you deem fair. If utilities are included in the lease, the landlord must maintain those utilities even if the tenant's not paying their rent. It's one of those things that the government's just looking after the tenant, right? So for that reason, I usually say, look, separately meter if you have a legal apartment, right? But it's one of those things you have to look out for. And in all these things, you have to be mindful that, yes, the government is looking out for the tenants. And so you have to really do your due diligence in terms of vetting potential tenants. The good thing is that right now it's a landlord's market. Like last year, I had a 2-bedroom apartment that came vacant. I put one ad in Kijiji, one ad in Craigslist, and in 24 hours, I got over 100 replies, right? And so normally what I would do is, you have a 1 o'clock appointment, a 1:30 showing. I couldn't do that. It was just an open house. And when people came and they saw 3, 4, 5 other families, now it became a bidding war, right? And so I was literally turning away good families. So it's not difficult right now to find good tenants at all. It's much more difficult right now for the tenant to find a good place. So the landlord can enter the property between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., whether the tenant is there or not, as long as you provided 24 hours written notice. If it's an emergency, you don't have to give notice. If the tenant wishes to end their tenancy, they got to give you 60 days written notice. They can only do that after the first year of the lease is up, or unless you agree to it.
Sorry, you said the one that the tenant cannot end within the first year. If I have to go, what are your options then?
So you'd have to go to the landlord-tenant board and essentially you sue them, right? Because they're liable now. So you can report that to the credit bureau, put that in the credit report once you have a judgment against them, right? And once you have a judgment, if you take it from the landlord-tenant board to small claims court, you can now start garnishing the wages. Right?
Okay.
So the question is, what would have happened if within the first year the tenant just takes off, right? You have to go to the landlord-tenant board, get a judgment there. You could then take that to small claims court to pursue further remedies. So there are a number of reasons why a landlord can end a tenancy and evict a tenant, right? Obviously not paying their rent in full each month, paying rent late, damage to the property. Illegal activity is probably the quickest one. You can get them out in 14 days. Affecting the safety of others. Those are typically the reasons why. Also for personal use, right? So too many people in the rental unit. If the landlord wants the rental unit for their own use, this is one that changed last year as well. So prior to this, all you had to do was give the tenant 90 days before. You'd say, okay, well, I have family moving here. They need the place. You got to leave, right? Now, the government has said you have to give them 1 month's rent if you want them out. And you have to go to the landlord-tenant board and prove that your reason is legit. You actually have family, or it is some kind of hardship or whatever. And you still have to pay them, right?
And it's a direct relation.
Yeah. You've been through
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
So it has to be like, my mother, my father, my son, my daughter. It can't be my second grandfather's father. It can't
Removed,
be,
yeah.
it has to be a direct relation.
It's an uphill battle to try and prove that. And then you still have to give them 1 month's rent. Yeah, so also if obviously you've sold the property and their first year lease is up and you've agreed to the seller to give them vacant possession, you can get the tenant out that way as well. If you have to do major repairs or renovations, you can get them out. Typically though, if they fight you on it, you're going to have to compensate them. You have to give them money to stay somewhere.
Oh, jeez.
Question?
It's really
Or
good.
time.
Going back to the family, like, you still have, so it's, you have to pay that for 1 month's rent, but you still have to give them the 90-day notice?
Yeah,
Or-
both. Yeah.
or both?
I believe it's 60 days, and then you have to give them 1 month's rent or time, which makes it 90 days.
I-
So if you only give them
can
cash.
the 90 days without giving
Unpaid.
them money, giving them that 1 month instead.
Right, right. So the question was, what happens if the tenant is late, but then they pay up? But it's repeated behavior, month after month. They're late, they pay up, right? It's a frustrating process. It does come down to timing, though, right? So I think on the next slide, I talk about if they're late on the first, so they don't have it on the first, you serve them on the second, right, with a 14-day notice, right? If they pay within that 14 days, nothing happens, they get to stay. If the 14 days elapses, then you take it to the landlord-tenant board and you can get a bailiff to come out and evict them, right? So I don't know exactly how late they're paying, but if it is more than 14 days, then obviously you can kick them out that way, right? But yeah, if they're paying like on the 3rd or the 5th, there's not much you can do, really isn't. Oh, really? Oh,
No.
they should have been out. Yeah, I mean, look, the landlord-tenant board is essentially, you're going to have an adjudicator sitting there, and the tenant will make their case, you'll make your case, and the adjudicator will make a decision, right? In a case like that, though, where it's repeated behavior, they should have the tenant out, particularly if they're months behind. There's no excuse for that. They should be out, right? Like in my cases, yeah, second day of the month, I served them the notice. 14 days later, we're going to court, and they're usually out within just over a month. So I don't run into that problem. But yeah,
The trick is to have documentation.
Yeah.
If it's repeated behavior, on that second or third day, you serve them the notice. If they do this month after month and you serve them 3 notices and then they pay up, then you take that to the adjudicator, they'll see that pattern and then you basically have the evidence. So the trick is to serve notice, take a picture of it, and then you provide that as part of your evidence when you serve your application to the Landlord Tenant Board to see an adjudicator.
and this is just what we were just talking about, 14-day notice and so on.